The first cut feels like a steel blade through the soul. She cooked for him every day for over a decade, and the millionaire didn't even know she was gone. Silence follows. Heavy, suffocating. The kind of silence that wraps around your chest and makes breathing feel like work. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're preparing dinner for someone who won't even thank you, or washing dishes while everyone else sleeps. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart. In the towering glass shadows of downtown Chicago, where Lake Michigan's cold winds carved through concrete canyons and steel dreams, there stood a penthouse that scraped the belly of the clouds. 43 floors above the bustling streets, where hot dog vendors called out in the September morning and commuters clutched their coffee like lifelines, Maribel Guadalupe Herrera moved through a kitchen that cost more than most people's homes. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of burns and cuts that told stories of love served on porcelain plates, gripped the marble countertop as she steadied herself against another sleepless night. The Sub-Zero refrigerator hummed its expensive tune, but the sound felt hollow in the cavernous space lined with custom Italian cabinets that gleamed like mirrors under LED lights that never quite felt warm enough. At 62, Maribel carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned that strength could be found in silence, that grace could bloom even in the darkest soil of disrespect. Her graying hair was pulled back in the same simple bun she had worn for 12 years, secured with a bobby pin that had lost its shine long ago. Her uniform, a plain gray dress with pockets deep enough to hold her dreams and disappointments, had been pressed the night before in her small apartment on Chicago's South Side, where the L train rattled past her window every morning at 5:47 a.m., a mechanical rooster that called her to another day of invisible labor. The kitchen where she stood was a monument to wealth without soul. Imported marble from Carrara caught the early light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city she loved but could barely afford to live in anymore. Professional-grade appliances worth more than a BMW sat like silent sentinels, their stainless steel surfaces so polished they reflected her tired face back at her in fragments. Here, an eye, there a wrinkled cheek, everywhere the evidence of years spent nourishing a family that saw her as furniture that occasionally moved. The Viking range with its 8 gas burners could feed an army, but most mornings it heated only coffee for one man who drank it black and bitter, just like his heart had become. This was the domain of Patrick Michael Reynolds, a man whose name graced buildings across the Midwest and whose signature appeared on contracts worth more money than small countries produced in a year. His fortune, built on commercial real estate investments and diversified through crypto portfolios that his accountants managed while he slept, had grown from millions to hundreds of millions during the boom years when Chicago's skyline expanded like a steel forest reaching toward heaven. His assets included downtown office buildings, luxury condominiums in Lincoln Park, and a collection of Bitcoin that his financial advisors insisted was the future of wealth. But all his money, all his properties, all his stock options and dividend checks and quarterly reports couldn't buy him the one thing Maribel had been giving him freely for over a decade: a home that felt alive. The early morning ritual began the same way it had for 4,380 days. Maribel's calloused fingers, strong from years of kneading dough and lifting heavy pots, moved across the controls of appliances that responded to her touch with the loyalty of old friends. She started the coffee, not the gourmet beans from some boutique roastery that Patrick's visitors expected, but the rich, dark roast she bought from a small shop in Pilsen, where the owner still remembered her name and asked about her grandson's baseball games. The aroma filled the kitchen like an old song, carrying with it memories of her mother's kitchen in Mexico City, where poverty couldn't dim the warmth that radiated from clay pots and wooden spoons worn smooth by loving hands. But this morning was different. This morning, the usual sounds were missing. No laughter echoed from the dining room where Patrick's wife Helena held court with her book club friends, their voices sharp as winter wind off the lake, as they dissected the lives of people they deemed beneath their Louboutin heels. No rustle of newspaper pages turning as Patrick consumed the financial section like communion, his eyes calculating the day's gains and losses while his breakfast grew cold. The silence pressed against Maribel's eardrums like deep water, and for the first time in 12 years, she wondered if anyone would notice if the coffee went unmade, if the kitchen went dark, if she simply walked out the door and never came back. The truth was settling in her bones like winter cold. She had become invisible even to herself, a ghost who cooked and cleaned and worried about other people's hunger while her own soul slowly starved. But the morning demanded its rituals, and Maribel Herrera had never been a woman to abandon her post, even when that post felt more like a prison with golden bars and granite countertops that reflected her sacrifices back at her in crystal-clear clarity. 12 years earlier, on a sweltering August day when the heat rising from Chicago's asphalt made the air shimmer like hope deferred, Maribel had answered a classified ad in the Tribune that would change her life forever. She rode 3 buses from her studio apartment in Little Village, her interview clothes, a borrowed blazer from her sister Carmen, and skirt hemmed by her own hands, clinging to her skin in the humid air that pressed against the city like God's own palm. The L train carried her north through neighborhoods where the houses grew larger and the lawns greener, where sprinkler systems painted rainbows in manicured yards and children rode bicycles that cost more than her monthly rent. The Reynolds mansion, with its limestone facade and iron gates that spoke of old money and older secrets, intimidated her before she even rang the doorbell. Helena Reynolds, then a woman of 45, whose beauty had been carefully maintained through procedures that erased the evidence of time but couldn't touch the coldness that lived behind her perfectly applied makeup, interviewed Maribel in a sunroom that overlooked Lake Michigan. The lake stretched toward the horizon like liquid mercury, beautiful and untouchable, just like everything else in this house that money had built, but love had never blessed. "Do you have formal training?" Helena had asked, her voice carrying the same chill as the central air conditioning that whispered through vents hidden in crown molding that cost more per foot than most people earned in a day. "No, senora," Maribel had replied, her accent wrapping around the English words like a warm shawl around shoulders that had carried too much for too long. "But I cook with my heart. My grandmother, she teach me that food without love, it just fills the stomach. Food with love, it feeds the soul." Helena's laugh had been sharp as broken glass. "Hearts don't pay bills, Miss Herrera. We need someone who can prepare meals for business associates, host dinner parties for clients who expect perfection. My husband's investments in downtown properties alone generate enough income to employ a dozen cooks. We can afford the best." But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The previous cook, a graduate of Le Cordon Bleu, whose resume read like a tour of Europe's finest kitchens, had walked out that very morning after a disagreement over menu planning had escalated into what Helena diplomatically called creative differences. With a dinner party for Patrick's business partners scheduled for that evening, a meal that could influence a multi-million-dollar development deal in the South Loop, Helena had no choice but to give the humble woman from Little Village a chance to prove herself. What happened that night became family legend, though the legend varied depending on who told it. Helena's version emphasized the chaos in the kitchen, the way Maribel had rearranged their carefully organized spice cabinet and used cast iron pans instead of the expensive copper cookware that hung like trophies on wrought iron hooks. But the guests told a different story. They spoke of flavors that reminded them of childhood summers, of bread so tender it seemed to melt on the tongue, of a soup that somehow tasted like comfort itself. These men who traded in millions, who measured success in stock portfolios and real estate acquisitions, found themselves slowing down over their meals, actually tasting their food instead of consuming it like fuel. Patrick Reynolds, a man who typically finished business dinners in 30 minutes so he could return to his computer screens displaying Bitcoin prices and stock charts, lingered at the table until nearly midnight. The roasted chicken Maribel had prepared, a simple bird seasoned with herbs she had brought from her own garden and cooked with techniques her mother had learned from her mother, somehow managed to make the conversation flow like wine. The men talked about their families, shared stories of their fathers and their fears, spoke of dreams that had nothing to do with profit margins or market volatility. That night, as Maribel cleaned the last of the dishes while the clock in the hallway chimed the arrival of a new day, Helena had offered her the job with the reluctant air of someone making a deal she didn't quite understand. The salary was more than Maribel had ever imagined earning, enough to help her sister Carmen with her son's medical bills, enough to send a little money back to her aging mother in Mexico City, enough to maybe, finally, start saving for the small restaurant she dreamed of opening someday. What Helena couldn't have known, what none of them could have predicted, was that Maribel would become more than just a cook. She would become the heart that pumped life through the arteries of a home that had forgotten how to feel. Her presence in the kitchen would transform not just their meals, but their entire way of being together. The house that had echoed with the hollow sounds of wealth would soon fill with the rich aromas of love made edible, of care seasoned with devotion and served on plates that finally held something worth savoring. But that first night was also the beginning of a different story, one of daily humiliations so small they seemed insignificant, but which accumulated over the years like paper cuts, each one tiny but altogether forming wounds that never quite healed. As Maribel learned the rhythms of the Reynolds household, she also learned its unspoken rules. She was to be invisible unless needed, silent unless spoken to, grateful always for the privilege of serving people who would never think to say thank you. The mornings began before dawn with the weight of expectations that grew heavier each year. Helena's demands multiplied like weeds in an untended garden. Breakfast ready by 7 sharp, coffee that stayed fresh throughout the morning, lunch preparations that could accommodate last-minute guests who might arrive to discuss Patrick's latest investment in cryptocurrency or his growing portfolio of Chicago properties. The financial world never slept, and neither, it seemed, did the appetite for meals that would impress potential partners in deals worth millions. Maribel learned to read the subtle signs that indicated Helena's mood. The sharp click of heels on marble floors meant impatience. The way she arranged flowers with violent precision meant frustration. The tone she used when speaking on the phone about Patrick's business dealings meant someone would pay the price for whatever was troubling her. Usually, that someone was Maribel. The eggs were overcooked this morning, Helena would announce to no one in particular as she swept through the kitchen, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never had to wonder where her next meal would come from. And the coffee was weak. "I don't know why we pay good money for substandard service." The words stung, not because they were true. Maribel's eggs were perfect, her coffee strong enough to wake the dead, but because they were spoken within earshot of other household staff, designed to diminish her in front of people who had learned to echo their employers' cruelties as a form of job security. The housekeeper, Maria Santos from El Salvador, would nod in agreement even though she had complimented the same breakfast just minutes before when Helena wasn't listening. The groundskeeper avoided eye contact entirely, understanding that solidarity with Maribel might cost him the position that helped him support 3 children and a wife with diabetes who couldn't work. This ecosystem of fear and false loyalty was carefully maintained by Helena's mastery of psychological warfare disguised as household management. She paid well enough to ensure compliance, but made it clear that security came with a price: complicity in the systematic erasure of Maribel's dignity. It was a special kind of cruelty, refined by years of practice, polished to a shine as bright as the silverware that Maribel polished every week while listening to criticism that cut deeper than any knife in her kitchen arsenal. The most painful moments came when Patrick's business associates visited for meals that could influence deals worth millions. Maribel would spend days preparing menus that showcased not just her culinary skills, but her deep understanding of how food could create atmospheres that fostered trust and openness. She knew that the right meal could make the difference between a successful negotiation and a missed opportunity, that flavors could speak languages that words sometimes couldn't reach. But when these important guests complimented the food, Helena would accept their praise as if she had cooked every dish herself, as if Maribel were simply an extension of the expensive appliances that required no acknowledgement for their function. "Oh, thank you," Helena would reply with practiced humility. "I do try to maintain certain standards." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that even Maribel sometimes wondered if she'd imagined her own hands preparing the food, her own heart seasoning each dish, with hope that this time, maybe this time, someone would see her. The children were different, at least at first. Patrick and Helena's son, Marcus, away at boarding school most of the year, had grown up tasting Maribel's love in every meal she prepared for his brief visits home. Their daughter Sarah, busy with her own family in New York, still called sometimes to ask for Maribel's recipe for the birthday cake that had made her childhood celebrations magical. But as the years passed and the children became adults with their own complicated relationships with wealth and privilege, even these small acknowledgments became rare, replaced by the kind of casual indifference that comes when someone has never had to consider where their comfort comes from. It was Helena's granddaughter Emma who changed everything, though none of them knew it at the time. 7 years old and curious as a cat, Emma had a way of appearing in the kitchen just as Maribel was beginning her most intricate preparations, her small hands eager to help, and her bright eyes full of questions that reminded Maribel why she had fallen in love with cooking in the first place. "Why do you sing when you stir the soup?" Emma asked one winter afternoon, as snow fell past the kitchen windows and the warm light from the stove painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Her grandmother was at her weekly spa appointment, and the house held the peaceful quiet that came when Helena's sharp energy was elsewhere. Maribel paused in her stirring, the wooden spoon warm in her hands as she considered the question. "Because the soup, she listens," she replied, her English still carrying the rhythms of her first language after all these years. "When you cook angry, the food tastes angry. When you cook sad, the food tastes sad. But when you cook with music in your heart, Misha, that's when the magic happens." Emma climbed onto the stool that Maribel kept nearby for moments exactly like this, her legs swinging as she watched the soup transform from simple ingredients into something that smelled like love itself. "Can you teach me the song?" And so began a friendship that would sustain Maribel through the darkest days ahead, a connection that reminded her that some hearts still knew how to recognize love when they tasted it. Emma became her shadow in the kitchen, learning not just recipes but the deeper truths that Maribel carried in her hands and heart. Together, they made tortillas from scratch, Emma's small fingers learning to pat the dough just right, while Maribel shared stories of her own grandmother, who had taught her that cooking was the closest thing to prayer that existed in this world. These moments with Emma were islands of joy in an ocean of indifference, precious enough that Maribel treasured each one, like the photographs she kept in her wallet of family members she rarely saw anymore because her work schedule left no time for her own life. When Emma laughed at Maribel's stories or clapped her hands when a cake came out perfect from the oven, something in Maribel's chest remembered how to feel light again, how to hope that all her years of service might mean something after all. But Helena noticed everything. And she particularly noticed when Emma preferred Maribel's company to the structured activities that had been planned for her development: piano lessons, French tutoring, tennis instruction, all designed to mold her into the kind of person who would never need to work with her hands or season her life with the salt of other people's tears. There would be consequences for this unauthorized education in the kitchen, consequences that would arrive like thunder after lightning, inevitable and devastating. The revolution came disguised as progress, announced with the fanfare that Helena reserved for her most dramatic domestic decisions. The newspaper clipping appeared on the kitchen counter one morning like an eviction notice, its glossy pages showing photographs of Chef Antoine Dubois, recently returned from a stint in Monaco, where he had cooked for royalty and celebrities whose names appeared in magazines that Maribel would never have reason to read. "We're upgrading our culinary program," Helena announced to the assembled household staff on a Tuesday morning when the October wind off Lake Michigan rattled the windows with the promise of winter's approach. She wore a burgundy silk blouse that cost more than Maribel's monthly rent, and her smile had the sharp edges of someone about to deliver what she considered good news. Chef Dubois will be taking over all meal planning and preparation. His credentials are impeccable, and his connections in the culinary world will be valuable for our entertaining. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that would consume everything Maribel had built over 12 years of faithful service. Chef Dubois, with his classical French training and his Instagram account full of artistic food presentations, represented everything that Helena believed was sophisticated and important. His arrival would relegate Maribel to the shadows, reduce her from chef to assistant, from the heart of the kitchen to just another pair of hands to clean up after someone else's creativity. But what hurt most was the way Helena delivered the news, not as a change that would affect someone who had devoted over a decade to their family's well-being, but as an improvement to be celebrated, an upgrade that everyone should appreciate. There was no acknowledgement of Maribel's years of service, no recognition that this decision would shatter the daily rhythms that had kept their household running like a well-tuned engine, fueled by devotion and expertise that couldn't be learned in any culinary school. Chef Dubois arrived on a Thursday morning with an entourage that included an assistant, a food photographer, and enough professional equipment to stock a restaurant. He swept through Maribel's kitchen like a hurricane, rearranging spice cabinets that had been organized with the logic of someone who actually cooked in this space every day, replacing her well-seasoned cast iron pans with imported French copper cookware that looked beautiful, but would take months to develop the patina that made food taste like home. "This is not how a professional kitchen functions," he announced in an accent that sounded more theatrical than authentic to Maribel's ear, trained after years of listening to the authentic accents of Chicago's immigrant communities. His hands, soft as a baby's and unmarked by the burns and scars that were the medals of a true cook's service, gestured dismissively at the organization system that had served the Reynolds family faithfully for over a decade. Maribel watched from the corner where she had been told to observe and learn, her own hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling as everything she had built was dismantled in the name of progress. Chef Dubois spoke of molecular gastronomy and foam techniques, of presentation styles that prioritized appearance over the deeper satisfactions that came from food cooked with genuine care. His dishes looked like small sculptures, beautiful and precise, and utterly lacking in the soul that had once made the Reynolds dining room feel like a place where families gathered rather than performed. The first dinner Chef Dubois prepared was a masterpiece of technical skill and emotional emptiness. Each plate emerged from the kitchen looking like a work of art destined for a museum, with microgreens arranged just so and sauces painted in precise patterns that spoke of mathematical precision rather than the organic flow of cooking that came from the heart. Helena was delighted, praising each course with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found validation for her sophisticated tastes. But even Helena couldn't hide the fact that the food, while beautiful, left everyone at the table somehow unsatisfied. The conversation that had once flowed as smoothly as wine now felt stilted and formal. Patrick, usually a man of few words about food, found himself pushing expensive ingredients around his plate with the distracted air of someone who had lost something but couldn't quite name what was missing. Emma was the most honest in her assessment. When her grandmother asked what she thought of the new chef's cooking, the 7-year-old considered the question with the seriousness it deserved before delivering her verdict. "It looks pretty, but it doesn't taste like a hug anymore." The observation was so accurate and so devastating that Helena quickly changed the subject. But the words lingered in the air like the aroma of bread that had once filled this house with warmth. Food that didn't taste like a hug. Perhaps that was the perfect description of what happened when technique replaced love, when cooking became about impressing rather than nourishing, when the heart was removed from the kitchen in favor of credentials and connections that looked good on paper but couldn't season a single dish with genuine care. Maribel's new role as kitchen assistant meant arriving earlier and staying later, preparing ingredients for dishes she would never be credited with influencing, cleaning equipment that someone else would use to create meals that lacked the essence she had spent 12 years pouring into this home. She became invisible in a new way, present but unacknowledged, necessary but unappreciated, watching as everything she had built was credited to someone who had learned cooking from books rather than from the deep well of love that had sustained her through years of quiet service. The transformation of the kitchen felt like watching a beloved friend undergo surgery that saved their life, but changed their personality completely. The space that had once hummed with warmth and purpose now felt clinical and cold, filled with equipment that prioritized efficiency over soul, supervised by someone who saw cooking as performance art rather than the most fundamental expression of care that exists between human beings. But the cruelest cut came not from Chef Dubois, who was at least honest in his ambition and pretension, but from Helena's systematic campaign to erase even the memory of what the kitchen had been before his arrival. She began referring to the dark days before they had proper culinary leadership, describing Maribel's years of service as a period they had endured rather than cherished, a time when they had made do with home cooking before discovering what real sophistication looked like. These comments were delivered with surgical precision, timed to inflict maximum damage, and delivered in front of people whose opinions mattered to Maribel, the other household staff, delivery workers from local markets who had known her for years, even Emma, whose young ears absorbed the poison being poured about the woman who had taught her that cooking could be an act of love rather than an exercise in showing off. The breaking point came on a gray November morning when the lake looked like hammered steel, and the wind carried the kind of cold that cut through winter coats and settled in bones unaccustomed to such harsh treatment. Chef Dubois was preparing for one of Patrick's most important business dinners, a meal designed to impress potential investors in a cryptocurrency venture that could add millions to an already vast fortune. The menu was ambitious even by his standards, 7 courses of molecular gastronomy that required precise timing and equipment that most restaurants couldn't afford. Maribel had been assigned the most menial tasks, peeling vegetables that would be transformed beyond recognition, cleaning equipment that Chef Dubois used once and abandoned, maintaining the endless supply of pristine towels and spotless surfaces that his cooking style demanded. She worked in silence, as had become her habit, invisible but essential, unnoticed but indispensable. The disaster began with something as simple as salt. Chef Dubois, preparing his signature foam that would crown the evening's main course, reached for what he assumed was sodium chloride but was actually sodium bicarbonate, baking soda that Maribel had been using to clean the copper pans. The chemical reaction that followed when he added it to his carefully calibrated mixture turned his masterpiece into something that looked like volcanic ash and smelled like regret. In the chaos that followed, screaming, blaming, the kind of professional meltdown that occurs when ego meets disaster, someone needed to be held responsible for the ruined dinner that would cost Patrick millions in lost investment opportunity. Chef Dubois, his reputation on the line and his pride wounded beyond repair, looked around the kitchen for someone to blame and found Maribel, quiet and uncomplaining as always, the perfect scapegoat for a failure that was entirely his own. "She sabotaged my mise en place," he declared with the dramatic flair of someone who had learned to cook from television shows rather than real kitchens where mistakes were fixed rather than blamed on others. "This woman has been undermining my work since I arrived, jealous because she knows she could never achieve what I create." Helena, faced with the choice between supporting the celebrity chef she had hired to elevate their status or defending the humble woman who had served their family faithfully for 12 years, made her decision with the cold calculation of someone who had never had to choose between pride and paycheck. The math was simple. Chef Dubois represented sophistication and advancement, while Maribel represented a past that Helena was eager to leave behind. "Pack your things," Helena told Maribel with the casual cruelty of someone firing a servant rather than dismissing a family member, because that's all Maribel had ever been to her, hired help who had somehow gotten the mistaken impression that years of faithful service might earn her something resembling loyalty or even basic fairness. "We can't have someone in our kitchen who sabotages our hospitality." The accusation hung in the air like incense from a funeral mass, poisoning everything it touched. Maribel stood there in her gray uniform with its small stains that told the story of 12 years spent nourishing this family, her hands still damp from washing dishes that would never again taste her cooking, and felt something inside her chest crack like an egg dropped on concrete. She could have defended herself, could have pointed out that Chef Dubois' failure came from his own carelessness rather than any sabotage, could have listed the hundreds of successful dinners she had prepared without incident over more than a decade of service. But dignity sometimes means knowing when words would be wasted, when the people passing judgment have already decided your guilt regardless of evidence or truth. Instead, Maribel untied her apron with the careful precision she brought to all her tasks, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter that had witnessed so many hours of her labor. Her purse, a simple black bag that contained her bus pass and wallet, and the few personal items that had sustained her through long days in someone else's kitchen, waited by the door like a faithful dog ready for a walk that might never end. 12 years, she said finally, not as a plea for reconsideration, but as a statement of fact, a summary of time that could never be recovered or repeated. The words carried the weight of every early morning, every late night, every holiday spent cooking for people who never thought to ask if she had somewhere else she'd rather be. Emma appeared in the doorway as Maribel gathered her things, her 7-year-old face bright with the kind of confusion that comes when the adult world reveals its capacity for inexplicable cruelty. "Maribel, are you going on vacation?" she asked with the optimism of someone who still believed that good people were always treated well, that fairness was a natural law rather than a luxury that most people couldn't afford. The goodbye between them was wordless, a hug that said everything their different languages and generations couldn't express. Maribel felt the child's arms around her waist and promised herself she would remember this moment when the anger came, when the hurt felt too heavy to carry, when she wondered if 12 years of love had meant anything at all to the people she had served. The November wind off Lake Michigan had teeth, and it bit through Maribel's coat as she waited for the bus that would carry her away from the glass tower that had been her second home for longer than some marriages last. The city stretched around her like a concrete ocean, full of lights and lives and stories that would continue without her, indifferent to one more working woman whose services were no longer required by people who had never understood the difference between cooking and nourishing, between serving food and serving love. Behind her, 43 floors above the street, the penthouse kitchen continued its evening routine without the woman who had given it life. Chef Dubois managed to salvage enough of his menu to avoid complete disaster, though the investors left earlier than planned, and Patrick's cryptocurrency venture would have to wait for another opportunity to secure funding. The evening was written off as a minor setback, the kind of thing that happens in business, nothing more significant than a bad day on the stock market or a disappointing quarterly report. But in the days that followed, something began to shift in the Reynolds household, something subtle at first, but growing more obvious as the weeks passed. The kitchen that had once felt like the heart of the home now seemed more like a laboratory, sterile and efficient, but somehow lacking the warmth that had once made even Helena's friends comment on the special atmosphere they felt when they visited. Food appeared on schedule, professionally prepared and artistically presented, but it no longer carried the indefinable quality that had made their dinner parties memorable, their family meals a source of comfort rather than simply sustenance. Patrick, consumed with his business affairs and the complex mathematics of wealth management, noticed the change primarily in its absence. The meals that had once anchored his days now felt like interruptions, fuel for a body that needed nourishment but found nothing particularly satisfying in the technically perfect dishes that appeared before him. He ate faster, spoke less during meals, found himself working through dinner while barely tasting food that looked like it belonged in a magazine, but somehow failed to satisfy hungers he couldn't quite name. Helena, initially delighted with the prestige that came from employing a celebrity chef, began to notice that her guests' enthusiasm for their dinner parties had cooled. The conversations that had once flowed like water over stones now felt forced and artificial, as if everyone was performing their enjoyment rather than actually experiencing it. The food was undeniably impressive, but it failed to create the atmosphere of warmth and welcome that had made their home a destination for Chicago's social and business elite. Even the household staff felt the change, though none would dare voice their observations aloud. The kitchen that had once been a place where they could catch moments of warmth and humor now felt tense and unwelcoming. Chef Dubois ran his domain with the iron discipline of someone who saw cooking as warfare rather than art, barking orders and accepting no input from people he considered beneath his professional status. The easy camaraderie that had developed around Maribel's gentle presence was replaced by the kind of workplace anxiety that makes people count the hours until they can escape. Emma, too young to understand the politics that had removed her favorite teacher from the kitchen, asked repeatedly when Maribel would return from her vacation. Her questions became a source of awkward silence at family meals, reminders of a loss that the adults preferred not to acknowledge. Helena's explanations grew more elaborate and less convincing as the weeks passed, stories about new opportunities and better positions that rang false, even to a 7-year-old who had learned to recognize the different flavors of truth and lies. Winter settled over Chicago like a gray blanket that muffled sound and reduced the world to sharp contrasts of warmth and cold, of shelter and exposure. The lake froze at its edges, and snow piled in drifts that transformed the city's familiar landmarks into abstract sculptures that spoke of endurance and patience. In the penthouse that overlooked this winter landscape, life continued with the mechanical precision of expensive appliances running according to their programming, functional but somehow hollow. Christmas approached with all its attendant obligations and expectations. Helena threw herself into planning the kind of holiday entertaining that would be photographed for lifestyle magazines, complete with decorations that required a crew of professionals to install and maintain. The menu for their annual Christmas Eve dinner was designed to showcase Chef Dubois' skills while impressing guests whose own wealth and status required increasingly elaborate efforts to surprise or delight. But as the holiday preparations intensified, the absence of something essential became impossible to ignore. The house looked magnificent, decorated with the kind of precision that money could buy and professional designers could execute. The menu read like poetry, each course a masterpiece of technique and creativity. The guest list included names from Chicago's most influential circles, people whose presence would cement the Reynolds family's position in the city's social hierarchy. Yet something was missing, something that had nothing to do with money or status or professional recognition. Emma expressed it best when she asked her grandmother why the house didn't smell like Christmas anymore, why the kitchen felt so quiet, why the food looked so pretty but tasted so lonely. Her questions hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had gone out, reminders of warmth that had once filled every corner of their home, but had somehow vanished without anyone noticing exactly when or how. The answer to Emma's questions was spending Christmas in a 1-bedroom apartment in Little Village, where Maribel had returned to the neighborhood of her youth to rebuild a life that had been shattered by accusations as false as they were devastating. The apartment was small and the heat inconsistent, but it welcomed her with the kind of honesty that wealth couldn't buy. Walls that had sheltered families who understood the value of hard work, floors that had been worn smooth by people who knew the difference between having a house and having a home. Maribel spent the weeks after her dismissal in the kind of reflection that comes when a life's work is suddenly stripped away, leaving nothing but time to consider what had been lost and what might yet be possible. The savings account that had grown slowly over 12 years of faithful service provided a buffer against immediate poverty, but it also represented dreams deferred, the small restaurant she had imagined opening, the return to Mexico to care for her aging mother, the simple pleasure of cooking for people who would appreciate her efforts rather than taking them for granted. The hardest part wasn't the loss of income or the uncertainty about the future, but the systematic destruction of her reputation that followed her dismissal. Helena, perhaps feeling some unconscious guilt about the circumstances of Maribel's firing, had made sure that word of the sabotage spread through the network of wealthy families who employed domestic staff. The story, growing more elaborate with each telling, painted Maribel as unreliable and vindictive, the kind of employee who couldn't be trusted in positions that required loyalty and discretion. Job hunting became an exercise in humiliation as potential employers, warned off by whispered rumors and careful insinuations, found reasons to hire other candidates despite Maribel's obvious qualifications and experience. The professional network she had built over decades of faithful service evaporated like morning mist, leaving her isolated and struggling to understand how 12 years of dedication could be erased so completely by one afternoon's false accusations. But Maribel was not a woman who surrendered easily, and the skills that had sustained her through years of unappreciated service now became the foundation for a different kind of survival. She began cooking for neighbors who remembered her reputation from before her years of service to the wealthy, people who measured quality by flavor rather than presentation, who understood that the best meals came from hearts that cooked with love rather than ambition. Word spread slowly through the immigrant communities of Chicago's South and West Sides. Maribel Herrera was cooking again, and her food carried the kind of soul that reminded people of home, of mothers and grandmothers who had fed families with whatever they could afford, but somehow made it taste like abundance. Orders began coming in for birthday parties and wedding celebrations, for quinceañeras and funeral receptions where food needed to comfort as much as nourish. Working from her small apartment kitchen, using equipment that belonged in a museum compared to the professional-grade appliances she had once commanded, Maribel rediscovered the joy of cooking for people who appreciated her gifts. Each meal she prepared was received with the kind of gratitude that had been absent from her years of service to the Reynolds family, honest appreciation from people who understood the difference between buying dinner and being fed by someone who cared about their happiness. The work was harder physically, carrying groceries up 3 flights of stairs, washing dishes in a sink that barely held a large pot, shopping for ingredients at markets where every dollar mattered in ways that Patrick Reynolds's fortune made impossible for his household to comprehend. But it was also more satisfying emotionally, a return to the fundamental relationship between cook and community that wealth often obscured behind layers of professional distance and social hierarchy. Emma's questions about Maribel's return grew more insistent as winter deepened into the kind of cold that made Chicago feel like an Arctic outpost rather than a Midwestern city. Helena's explanations became shorter and more dismissive, but the child's intuitive understanding that something important was missing from their home couldn't be silenced by adult irritation or social convenience. She began refusing to eat Chef Dubois' elaborate creations, pushing food around her plate with the kind of stubborn resistance that spoke of deeper hungers that technical perfection couldn't satisfy. Patrick, buried in year-end financial reports and tax planning that would help him keep as much of his growing fortune as legally possible, barely noticed the domestic tensions that swirled around him like lake-effect snow, present but not immediately threatening to his primary concerns. His cryptocurrency investments had performed better than expected, his real estate portfolio continued generating steady income, and his net worth had grown by several $1,000,000 during the months since Maribel's departure. By any measure that mattered to his accountants, the year had been an unqualified success. But success, he was beginning to learn, could be measured in ways that didn't appear on quarterly statements or tax documents. The meals that punctuated his days had become purely functional, fuel for a body that needed nourishment, but found nothing particularly memorable in even the most elaborately prepared dishes. He ate faster and focused less on the food itself, treating dinner as another business appointment to be completed efficiently rather than experienced fully. The change was subtle enough that he might never have noticed it, if not for a conversation with his business partner James Morrison, whose own household employed a cook whose skills had become legendary among Chicago's business community. James mentioned how much he looked forward to going home each evening, how the aromas that greeted him at his front door made the stress of trading in volatile markets feel manageable, how meals with his family had become the anchor that kept him grounded despite the abstract nature of wealth that existed primarily as numbers on computer screens. "You used to talk about your cook the same way," James observed during a lunch meeting where they discussed investment strategies for the coming year. "That woman from Mexico who made those incredible tamales for your Christmas parties. Helena said you had to let her go for some professional issue, but I hope you found someone equally talented. Food like that doesn't come along often." The comment lodged in Patrick's mind like a splinter, small but persistent, a reminder of something he had lost without realizing its value until it was gone. He began to pay more attention to the meals that appeared before him, trying to understand why food that looked like art failed to satisfy in ways that simpler dishes once had. The technical perfection of Chef Dubois' creations was undeniable, but they lacked some essential quality that Patrick couldn't identify, but definitely missed. It was Emma who provided the vocabulary he needed to understand his own dissatisfaction. During one of their rare conversations, Patrick's schedule left little time for lengthy interactions with his granddaughter. She explained her refusal to eat dinner with the kind of 7-year-old logic that cut straight to the truth adults often spent years avoiding. "The food doesn't remember how to love anybody," she said with a seriousness that children bring to observations that adults find uncomfortably accurate. "When Maribel cooked, the food knew our names. Now it just knows how to look pretty." The insight was so sharp and so accurate that Patrick found himself thinking about it for days afterward, turning over the idea that food could remember, that meals could know names, that cooking might involve forms of communication that transcended mere nutrition or even pleasure. Emma's words gave him a framework for understanding why his perfectly prepared meals felt somehow incomplete, why dining at home had become a chore rather than a comfort. But understanding the problem didn't automatically reveal its solution, especially when that solution would require admitting that they had made a mistake that couldn't be fixed simply by writing larger checks or hiring more expensive professionals. Helena had invested too much social capital in the decision to employ Chef Dubois to reverse course without losing face among the circles where such decisions were evaluated and judged. The celebrity chef had become part of their family's brand, a symbol of their sophistication and commitment to excellence that couldn't be abandoned without careful consideration of the social consequences. Spring's arrival in Chicago brought the kind of hope that only people who have survived brutal winters can truly appreciate. The lake began to thaw, revealing water that reflected sky instead of ice that reflected nothing, and the city's residents emerged from their thermal cocoons with the grateful exhaustion of survivors. Trees that had looked dead for months suddenly exploded with green life, and the air carried promises of warmth that made the previous months of suffering feel worthwhile. For Maribel, spring meant the possibility of expanding her small catering business beyond the confines of her apartment kitchen. She had saved enough money to consider renting actual commercial space, perhaps even hiring an assistant to help with the growing number of orders from communities that had rediscovered the pleasure of eating food prepared with genuine care rather than professional ambition. The dream of her own restaurant, deferred but never abandoned, began to feel possible again. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Father Miguel Santos, the priest at St. Augustine's Church in Little Village, who had heard about Maribel's situation through the networks of care and communication that connected Chicago's immigrant communities like underground rivers of mutual support. Father Santos needed someone to cater a fundraising dinner for church renovations, someone who could prepare food that would honor the memories of parishioners' homelands while staying within a budget that reflected the economic realities of working families rather than the abstract mathematics of wealth management. The dinner was scheduled for early May, timed to coincide with celebrations of spring and renewal that felt especially meaningful to people who had spent the winter wondering if warmth would ever return. Maribel threw herself into planning a meal that would showcase not just her technical skills, but her deep understanding of how food could create community, how flavors could tell stories that brought people together rather than dividing them into categories of sophistication and simplicity. The evening of the dinner, St. Augustine's Parish Hall, filled with families whose faces reflected the diversity that made Chicago feel like a collection of small towns rather than a single large city. Children ran between tables while their parents and grandparents shared stories in Spanish and English, sometimes switching languages mid-sentence in the beautiful code switching that created its own poetry of cultural fusion and adaptation. Maribel's menu honored traditions while acknowledging the present. Tamales that carried recipes from her grandmother's kitchen in Mexico City, but made with ingredients available in Chicago markets. Mole that took 2 days to prepare properly, its complex flavors, speaking of patience and dedication that couldn't be rushed or simplified. Rice and beans cooked with techniques that her mother had learned from her mother, but seasoned with herbs from the urban garden that parish volunteers had planted in the vacant lot next to the church. But the real magic happened not in the individual dishes, but in the atmosphere they created. Tables that had been filled with strangers became extended families by the time dessert appeared. Children who had been shy at the beginning of the evening were sharing jokes with elderly neighbors who had rediscovered the pleasure of feeling useful and appreciated. Adults who worked multiple jobs just to pay rent found themselves laughing with the kind of freedom that comes when community provides a brief refuge from individual struggle. Word of the dinner's success spread through networks that had nothing to do with Chicago's business and social elite, but everything to do with the authentic communication that happens when people recognize genuine quality and care. Orders began coming in from other churches, from community centers, from families planning celebrations that needed food worthy of their joy and gratitude. Among the dinner guests that evening was someone whose presence Maribel didn't notice, but whose attention would change everything. Emma Reynolds, brought to the church by her Tuesday afternoon babysitter, Maria Santos, who happened to be Father Santos's sister, and who had heard Emma's endless questions about when Maribel would return from her mysterious vacation. Emma's reunion with Maribel was everything a 7-year-old's heart could hold, tears and laughter and hugs that lasted until other dinner guests began to wonder if they were witnessing something more significant than a casual meeting between a former employee and her employer's granddaughter. Emma's joy was so pure and so obvious that it attracted attention from adults who had learned to recognize the difference between politeness and genuine emotion. "I knew you weren't on vacation," Emma announced with the satisfaction of someone whose intuition had been proven correct, despite months of adult explanations that hadn't quite made sense. "I knew you were just cooking somewhere else until we could find you again." The conversation that followed, conducted in the mixture of English and Spanish that Emma had absorbed during her kitchen lessons, revealed the depth of loss that the child had experienced when Maribel disappeared from her life without explanation or opportunity for goodbye. Emma's questions about cooking techniques and family recipes hadn't stopped just because her teacher was no longer available to answer them. Instead, they had accumulated like letters written to someone who might never read them, expressions of curiosity and affection that had no outlet except the hope that somehow, someday, they would be reunited with their proper recipient. Maria Santos, who had watched this reunion with the careful attention of someone who understood family dynamics beyond their official definitions, recognized an opportunity to address suffering that had been hidden beneath layers of social propriety and adult pride. Emma's obvious happiness at finding Maribel again was matched only by Maribel's equally obvious joy at seeing the child whose questions had once made long days in an unappreciative household feel worthwhile. The drive back to the Reynolds penthouse that evening was filled with Emma's chatter about everything she had learned from observing other cooks in Maribel's absence, her criticism of Chef Dubois' creations, and her detailed questions about whether Maribel might consider returning to teach her more about cooking techniques that couldn't be learned from television shows or cookbook photographs. Maria Santos listened with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades navigating the complicated relationships between employers and employees, understanding that Emma's requests reflected deeper hungers than could be satisfied by even the most elaborate professional meals. That night, as Emma recounted her evening's adventure to grandparents who had been wondering why she had become so resistant to eating the sophisticated meals that cost them hundreds of dollars per week to provide, Patrick and Helena began to understand that their household's problems went deeper than simple professional preferences or even questions of culinary competence. Their granddaughter's happiness had been affected by domestic decisions they had made without considering her perspective, and her persistent questions about Maribel's whereabouts reflected genuine loss rather than mere childhood curiosity about adult business. Helena's first impulse was to dismiss Emma's emotional response as the kind of temporary attachment that children form with anyone who pays them individual attention, the sort of thing that would be forgotten if properly managed with distractions and explanations. But Emma's detailed knowledge of cooking techniques and her sophisticated understanding of flavor combinations suggested that her relationship with Maribel had involved genuine learning rather than mere entertainment, education in skills and values that no money could purchase from professional instructors. Patrick, whose business success had come partly from his ability to recognize when situations required more than surface-level solutions, began to wonder if their household's growing dysfunction might be connected to personnel decisions that had seemed obvious at the time, but whose consequences had been more far-reaching than anyone anticipated. The meals that had once anchored their family life had become purely functional, and even their elaborate dinner parties now generated polite compliments rather than the enthusiastic praise that had once made their home a preferred destination for Chicago's social elite. The investigation that followed Emma's revelation proceeded with the careful discretion that wealthy families apply to situations that might reflect poorly on their judgment or decision-making capabilities. Helena made phone calls to friends whose domestic staff moved within the same circles where Maribel had once worked, inquiring about her current situation without explicitly admitting that they might have made an error in terminating her employment. What Helena discovered challenged every assumption she had made about Maribel's character and professional competence. Far from being unable to find new employment due to the professional failures that Helena had implied when spreading word of her dismissal, Maribel had become increasingly successful as an independent caterer, building a reputation for excellence that was based entirely on the quality of her work rather than mere social connections or professional credentials. More troubling were the conversations with other employers who had known Maribel during her years of service to the Reynolds family and who had never heard anything but praise for her reliability, skill, and character. The sabotage that had supposedly justified her dismissal was mentioned by no one Helena spoke with, suggesting that either her information network was incomplete or that the story had been accepted without the verification that such serious accusations normally required. The most disturbing revelation came from Chef Dubois himself, who had begun making claims about his role in Maribel's dismissal that went far beyond what had actually occurred. In conversations with other professionals in Chicago's culinary community, he had embellished his version of events to make himself appear more decisive and authoritative, describing a situation where he had discovered and exposed incompetence that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. But his embellishments had grown increasingly elaborate and self-contradictory. leading some of his professional contacts to question whether his account of events could be entirely accurate. Several people mentioned to Helena that they found it curious that such an experienced cook would suddenly develop problems with basic kitchen management after years of successful service, especially since Maribel's reputation in Chicago's domestic service community had been excellent. These conversations forced Helena to confront the possibility that she had made a decision based on incomplete information at best or deliberate deception at worst. The social embarrassment of admitting such an error was considerable, but the ongoing dysfunction in their household was becoming equally problematic for different reasons. Emma's persistent unhappiness about their food situation was beginning to affect her relationship with her grandparents, and even Patrick had begun making comments about missing the way things used to taste. The decision to attempt reconciliation came gradually, emerging from a series of family conversations where Emma's perspective was given more weight than adult pride or professional considerations. Her detailed knowledge of cooking techniques and her articulate explanations of why certain meals satisfied while others left her feeling empty demonstrated that her education with Maribel had been more valuable than anyone had realized at the time. Patrick's business experience had taught him that admitting mistakes early cost less than defending them indefinitely. And Helena's social instincts suggested that their domestic situation was becoming conspicuous enough to generate the kind of gossip that would be more damaging than acknowledging they had acted hastily in terminating a valued employee. Even Chef Dubois' increasingly erratic behavior and growing demands for creative control over aspects of household management beyond food preparation suggested that their upgrade in culinary sophistication had created new problems rather than solving old ones. The approach to Maribel was handled with the delicacy that complex family situations require, initiated through Maria Santos, whose relationship with both households gave her unique insight into the feelings and motivations of everyone involved, rather than a direct apology that might imply legal liability or social embarrassment. The initial contact took the form of inquiries about Maribel's availability for catering services that might be needed for summer entertaining. Maribel's response reflected the grace and wisdom that had sustained her through months of unjust exile from work she had loved and performed with distinction. She agreed to meet with Helena and Patrick to discuss catering possibilities, though her tone carried the kind of careful neutrality that people adopt when they have been hurt, but are willing to consider whether healing might be possible. The meeting took place at a downtown restaurant that was neutral territory for everyone involved, expensive enough to demonstrate respect for Maribel's new professional status, but not so exclusive as to emphasize the social distances that had contributed to their previous difficulties. Emma's presence at the lunch was not accidental. Her obvious happiness at being reunited with Maribel served as both evidence of what had been lost and motivation for what might be recovered. The conversation that followed was careful and formal on the surface, but underneath ran currents of emotion that spoke of relationships more complex than simple employer and employee. Helena's questions about catering services evolved into inquiries about whether Maribel might consider returning to regular household service, not as a replacement for Chef Dubois, but as a specialist in family meals and informal entertaining, where her particular skills would be most valuable. Patrick's contribution to the discussion focused on practical matters, compensation, working conditions, professional respect. But his questions revealed that he had spent more time thinking about their family's food situation than his previous inattention had suggested. His memories of specific dishes Maribel had prepared and his detailed knowledge of how their dinner parties had changed since her departure demonstrated that he had been paying attention even when his appreciation had not been explicitly expressed. But it was Emma who provided the honesty that adult diplomacy couldn't accommodate. Her direct questions about why Maribel had been sent away, her detailed complaints about how food had changed in her absence, and her straightforward request that Maribel return to teach her more about cooking techniques cut through the polite surface of the conversation, to address the emotions and relationships that actually mattered to everyone at the table. Maribel's response reflected months of reflection about what had been lost and what returning might cost or provide. Her dignity had been restored through her success as an independent caterer, and she was no longer economically dependent on employment with the Reynolds family. Any return would need to acknowledge her professional growth and reflect the respect that her skills deserved, both in terms of practical working conditions and interpersonal relationships. The negotiation that followed took place over several weeks and involved detailed discussions about responsibilities, authority, and the kind of mutual respect that would be necessary to rebuild working relationships that had been damaged by misunderstanding and false accusations. Chef Dubois' role in the household would need to be redefined in ways that acknowledged Maribel's expertise while avoiding direct conflicts over territory and authority. But the most important conversation happened between Maribel and Emma during one of the child's visits to her apartment while the adults negotiated practical details. Emma's questions about forgiveness and second chances, about why people sometimes made mistakes and whether those mistakes could be fixed, reflected her 7-year-old's wisdom about relationships and the courage required to trust people who had previously caused pain. Maribel's return to the Reynolds household in late spring was handled with the quiet dignity that had always characterized her approach to work and relationships. There was no dramatic announcement or elaborate ceremony, just the gradual restoration of rhythms and routines that had once made their house feel like a home where people nourished each other as well as themselves. The kitchen that had felt sterile and cold began to warm as Maribel's presence brought back the aromas and energies that had once made it the heart of family life. Emma resumed her cooking lessons with the enthusiasm of someone whose education had been interrupted, but not forgotten, and even Helena began to remember why she had once been proud of the meals their household provided to guests and family alike. But the most significant change was in Patrick, who rediscovered the pleasure of eating food that had been prepared not just to impress but to satisfy, to comfort, to celebrate the simple fact that nourishing people well was one of the most fundamental expressions of care that existed between human beings. His meals became moments of pause and appreciation rather than merely functional necessities, and his growing understanding of what Maribel brought to their family extended far beyond the technical skills that prepared their food. The resolution of their domestic crisis took the form of recognition rather than grand gestures, acknowledgement that some forms of value couldn't be measured in professional credentials or social status, that expertise developed through years of devoted practice was worthy of respect regardless of its academic pedigree, and that the atmosphere of a home was created by the care and attention of people who understood that feeding others well was both art and service, both skill and love. Emma's education continued with renewed intensity, her questions and observations now welcomed as contributions to kitchen conversations rather than interruptions to be managed. Her growing understanding of cooking techniques was matched by her deeper appreciation for the values and traditions that good food could carry from one generation to the next, lessons that no school could teach, but that were essential to understanding what made life worth living. As summer settled over Chicago like a warm blanket that invited families to linger over meals and conversations that didn't need to end according to schedules or obligations, the Reynolds penthouse became once again a place where food created the atmosphere for relationships to flourish rather than merely providing fuel for bodies that needed nourishment. The sounds of laughter began to return to their dining room, and the aromas that filled their kitchen spoke once more of love made edible, of care seasoned with devotion and served on plates that held something worth savoring. However, the full reconciliation wasn't as simple as Maribel's return to the kitchen. There were layers of hurt that needed healing, trust that required rebuilding, and most importantly, acknowledgement of the injustice that had driven her away. Chef Dubois, perhaps sensing the shifting dynamics, began to reveal his true character more openly. His demands became increasingly unreasonable. His treatment of other staff members grew more imperious, and his claims about his culinary achievements started to unravel under closer scrutiny. It was during a particularly busy dinner service in July, and when the penthouse was hosting a gathering for Patrick's most important investors, that the final truth about Chef Dubois emerged. Under pressure to deliver the kind of meal that would justify his inflated reputation and even more inflated salary, he made a series of basic mistakes that would have been catastrophic if not for Maribel's quiet intervention. She corrected his seasoning when he wasn't looking, rescued a sauce that he had nearly ruined, and smoothly coordinated the timing of multiple courses while he focused on creating Instagram-worthy presentations that photographed beautifully, but often arrived at the table lukewarm or oversalted. The contrast between his theatrical performance and Maribel's efficient competence was too obvious for even Helena to ignore. While Chef Dubois commanded attention with dramatic gestures and elaborate explanations of his culinary philosophy, Maribel ensured that the food actually tasted good and arrived at the proper temperature. The guests, sophisticated palates accustomed to excellence, noticed the difference between the courses that bore Maribel's subtle influence and those that reflected only Chef Dubois' artistic vision. After the guests departed, raving about a meal that succeeded despite rather than because of the celebrity chef's contributions, Patrick and Helena found themselves facing an uncomfortable truth. They had hired expertise that was more theatrical than practical, more concerned with social media presence than actual culinary skill. Meanwhile, they had dismissed someone whose abilities were proven not by Instagram followers or magazine features, but by years of consistently excellent results and the kind of deep culinary knowledge that can only come from decades of devoted practice. The conversation that followed between Patrick, Helena, and Maribel took place in the quiet of the kitchen after the last dish had been washed and the evidence of the evening's success had been stored away. This time, there were no formal negotiations or careful diplomatic language. Instead, there was the kind of honesty that comes when people finally acknowledge truths they have been avoiding for too long. Helena's apology, when it finally came, was perhaps the most difficult word she had ever spoken, admitting that she had acted hastily, that she had valued credentials over character, that she had allowed professional jealousy and false accusations to blind her to the value of someone who had served their family faithfully for over a decade. These acknowledgments came with the weight of someone who had learned that social status couldn't protect her from the consequences of treating people poorly. Patrick's contribution was more pragmatic, but equally meaningful. He spoke of the business principle that the best investments are often the least flashy ones, that sustainable success comes from reliable fundamentals rather than spectacular innovations that lack substance. His recognition of Maribel's value was framed in terms he understood: return on investment, consistent performance, the irreplaceable nature of true expertise. But the emotion behind his words was unmistakable. But it was Maribel's response that transformed their conversation from apology into genuine reconciliation. She spoke not of forgiveness, that would come later, earned through changed behavior rather than words, but of understanding. She had learned during her months away that respect couldn't be demanded or negotiated. It had to be demonstrated through actions that matched professed values. Her willingness to return wasn't based on need for employment or acceptance of their apology, but on a recognition that some relationships, once broken, could be rebuilt stronger than they had been before. The practical arrangements that followed reflected this new understanding. Maribel would return not as a subordinate employee reporting to a celebrity chef, but as the household's chief culinary officer with authority over all aspects of meal planning and preparation. Chef Dubois could remain if he chose, but in a clearly defined role that acknowledged Maribel's seniority and primary responsibility for the family's daily needs. More importantly, her compensation would reflect not just her current market value as a successful independent caterer, but also recognition of the years when her contributions had been undervalued. But perhaps the most significant change was in the atmosphere of the household itself. Emma's joy at having her cooking mentor permanently restored was matched by the visible relief of other staff members who had watched the previous month's dysfunction with growing concern. The kitchen became once again a place where people enjoyed working rather than simply enduring their shifts, where expertise was respected regardless of its formal credentials, where the measure of success was the satisfaction of people being well fed rather than the Instagram worthiness of individual dishes. The transformation was noticed beyond the household as well. Patrick's business associates began commenting again on the exceptional quality of meals served at the Reynolds home, and Helena's dinner parties regained their reputation as events worth attending not just for social networking, but for genuinely memorable experiences. The food served at these gatherings carried the ineffable quality that comes when technical skill is combined with genuine care for the people being served. Summer deepened into autumn, and the kitchen that had once felt like a battlefield between competing philosophies of cooking became a place where tradition and innovation could coexist. Maribel began incorporating some of the modern techniques she had observed during Chef Dubois' tenure, but always in service of flavor and satisfaction rather than mere visual impact. Her cooking evolved, enriched by new knowledge, but grounded in the fundamental understanding that the best meals nourish both body and spirit. Emma's education continued with renewed depth and purpose. She learned not just recipes and techniques, but the deeper lessons about patience, attention to detail, and the satisfaction that comes from creating something that brings joy to others. Her questions grew more sophisticated as her understanding deepened, and Maribel found in her eager student a reminder of why cooking had first captured her own imagination decades earlier. The relationship between Maribel and the Reynolds family had been fundamentally altered by the crisis that had driven them apart and the process that had brought them back together. They could never return to the easy assumptions that had characterized their earlier years, but they had discovered something more valuable, a mutual respect based on proven worth rather than hierarchical obligations, an understanding of each other's value that had been tested by separation and strengthened by choice rather than necessity. As the year turned toward winter again, the kitchen filled with the familiar aromas of holiday preparation, but with a difference that everyone could sense even if they couldn't quite articulate it. The food being prepared carried not just the flavors that had made previous celebrations memorable, but also the deeper satisfaction that comes from work that is valued and workers who are respected. The meals that emerged from Maribel's hands were seasoned with dignity restored, flavored with relationships healed, and served with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that her contributions were finally being appreciated for their true worth. The Christmas Eve dinner that year became legendary, not just for its culinary excellence, but for the atmosphere it created. Guests spoke of feeling welcomed into a home where the food seemed to carry the warmth of genuine hospitality, where every dish reflected not just technical skill, but a deep understanding of what it means to nourish others well. Children who were usually restless during formal dinners found themselves engaged and comfortable, sensing somehow that they were in a place where their presence was valued rather than merely tolerated. Emma, now 8 years old and considerably more sophisticated in her understanding of cooking and its deeper meanings, served as an unofficial ambassador between the kitchen and the dining room. Her explanations of various dishes to curious guests revealed not just knowledge of ingredients and techniques, but appreciation for the care and attention that had created each element of the meal. Her pride in what she had learned from Maribel was obvious and infectious, and several guests found themselves asking for cooking advice, not from the woman who had prepared their food, but from the child who had learned to see cooking as an expression of love rather than mere sustenance. The evening's success was measured not in the compliments received or the social connections made, but in the quiet satisfaction that comes when people gather around food that has been prepared with genuine care and attention. Conversations flowed naturally from course to course. Laughter punctuated the gentle clatter of silverware on china, and the dining room filled with the kind of warmth that money cannot purchase, but which emerges spontaneously when people feel genuinely welcomed and well cared for. As the guests departed into the cold Chicago night, many lingered in the foyer to express their appreciation not just for the meal, but for the entire experience. They spoke of feeling nourished in ways that went beyond mere physical satisfaction, of being reminded why sharing meals with others was one of humanity's oldest and most meaningful rituals. Several mentioned that they hadn't enjoyed a dinner party so much in years, though they couldn't quite explain what had made this evening different from other elegant meals they had shared at comparable homes. The answer, of course, lay in the kitchen, where Maribel was completing the evening's final tasks with the quiet efficiency that had always characterized her work. The difference was invisible to guests, but fundamental to everything they had experienced. They had been fed by someone who understood that cooking is both craft and care, who brought to her work not just technical skill, but genuine investment in the happiness and satisfaction of the people she served. Patrick, loosening his formal tie as he reflected on the evening's success, realized that he had recovered something he hadn't even known he was missing. The sense that his home was a place worth returning to at the end of difficult days, that meals with family and friends could be sources of genuine pleasure rather than mere social obligations, that the money he spent on household staff could purchase not just services, but the kind of attention that transformed houses into homes. Helena, removing her jewelry in the quiet of her bedroom, found herself thinking about the elements that create truly memorable hospitality. Her previous focus on impressive presentations and celebrity credentials had produced meals that looked perfect in photographs, but somehow failed to satisfy deeper hungers. The evening's success reminded her that the most sophisticated dinner parties were those where guests felt welcomed rather than impressed, where the food served as a foundation for connection rather than a performance to be applauded. But it was in Emma's room, where the child was too excited to sleep, bubbling with questions about everything she had observed and learned during the evening's preparations, that the true measure of the day's significance became clear. Her detailed understanding of how various dishes had been prepared, her appreciation for the timing and coordination required to serve multiple courses seamlessly, and most importantly, her recognition that the evening's success had come from love as much as skill, demonstrated that she had absorbed lessons that would serve her throughout her life. "Maribel," she asked as her cooking mentor tucked her into bed with flour-dusted hands that still carried the evening's warmth, "why does food taste different when you make it with people you care about?" The question carried the kind of wisdom that often emerges from children who have been allowed to observe adult work closely enough to understand its deeper meanings. Maribel's answer, delivered in the mixture of English and Spanish that had become their private language of kitchen instruction, spoke of the ancient connections between nourishment and affection, between taking care of others' physical needs and expressing emotional bonds that often couldn't be put into words. "Because, mi amor," Maribel replied, smoothing the blanket around Emma's small form, "when we cook for people we love, we put our hearts in the food. And hearts, they have their own flavor that makes everything taste like home." The wisdom of that response would stay with Emma for the rest of her life, shaping not just her relationship with food and cooking, but her understanding of what it means to care for others through attention to their needs and comfort. She would carry forward the knowledge that the most important ingredient in any meal is the love that seasons it, that the best cooks are those who understand that feeding others well is one of the most fundamental ways humans express care and affection. As winter deepened into the new year, the rhythms and relationships in the Reynolds household settled into patterns that bore little resemblance to the dysfunction that had preceded Maribel's departure and return. The kitchen hummed with the kind of productive energy that comes when work is valued and workers are respected, when expertise is acknowledged regardless of its source, when the measure of success is satisfaction rather than mere appearances. The change was noticed throughout their social and professional circles, though most observers couldn't identify exactly what had shifted. Patrick's business associates mentioned the exceptional quality of meals served at his home. Helena's friends spoke of dinner parties that somehow felt more welcoming and memorable than similar gatherings elsewhere. And both found their home increasingly in demand as a venue for the kind of entertaining that built relationships rather than merely displayed wealth. But the most significant changes were invisible to outside observers, embedded in the daily routines and small interactions that define the quality of life within any household. Meals became occasions for genuine conversation rather than mere refueling. The kitchen became a place where family members lingered to chat rather than simply appearance for scheduled eating. And the entire penthouse took on the warmth that comes when people work together with mutual respect rather than hierarchical obligation. Maribel's success became a quiet legend in Chicago's domestic service community, proof that skill and dedication would eventually be recognized and valued, that treating workers with dignity ultimately benefited everyone involved. Her story spread through networks of housekeepers and cooks and caregivers, offering hope to others who sometimes wondered if their contributions would ever be truly appreciated. The restaurant she had once dreamed of opening evolved into something different, but equally satisfying. A consultation service for families who wanted to transform their approach to home cooking, who sought not just recipes, but understanding of how food could strengthen relationships and create the kind of domestic atmosphere where people flourished rather than merely coexisted. Emma's education continued with increasing sophistication, her questions revealing growing understanding not just of cooking techniques, but of the values and traditions that good food could carry from one generation to the next. She learned to see cooking as both practical skill and cultural preservation, as a way of honoring the past while nourishing the present and future. Her 8th birthday celebration, planned entirely around foods she had learned to prepare under Maribel's guidance, became a demonstration of how much she had absorbed during their kitchen conversations. The menu she designed reflected not just technical competence, but genuine understanding of how flavors could tell stories, how meals could create memories, how the act of feeding others well was one of the most meaningful ways to express love and care. As spring returned to Chicago, bringing with it the annual renewal that made the city's brutal winters seem worthwhile, the kitchen windows opened to let in air that carried promises of warmth and growth. The herbs that Maribel planted in window boxes and rooftop containers would soon provide fresh seasonings for meals that combined traditional techniques with ingredients that reflected Chicago's diverse food culture, creating a cuisine that was both rooted and innovative, both respectful of the past and responsive to present needs and possibilities. The story of Maribel Guadalupe Herrera and the Reynolds family had become something larger than its individual components, a testament to the power of recognizing value wherever it exists, of treating all work with dignity, of understanding that the most sophisticated households are those where everyone's contributions are valued and respected. It was a story about second chances and the courage required to admit mistakes, about the difference between purchasing services and building relationships, about the profound satisfaction that comes when people's best efforts are recognized and appreciated. But at its heart, it remained the story of a woman who understood that cooking is love made edible, that the best meals are those seasoned with care and served with attention to the happiness and satisfaction of those being fed. In a world that often values appearance over substance, credentials over character, innovation over fundamental excellence, Maribel's story served as a reminder that some truths are as old as humanity itself, that feeding others well is one of our most basic expressions of care, that skill developed through devoted practice is worthy of respect regardless of its formal recognition, and that the most important ingredient in any meal is the love that seasoned it. And have you ever cooked for someone who never said thank you? Have you ever felt invisible in a kitchen where your hands created comfort, but your heart received no recognition? Tell me in the comments about a time when your cooking was taken for granted, or when someone finally appreciated what your hands and heart had been offering all along. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another woman who cooks with her soul, who understands that the most important ingredient in any meal is the love that seasons it. For more heartfelt stories like this, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through kitchens and hearts that know the true meaning of nourishment. We'll see you in the next story.